This is Get Real with Deb Waterbury, a show where Dr. Deb gets real as she teaches through books and studies on topics relevant for today. And now, here is your host, Dr. Deb Waterbury.
Hello. We are still in our series of Finding Intimacy with God, Psalm by Psalm, and we're in week 5 this week. You know, it is, I've had so many discussions recently about finding this place where you know what God wants. You know, people come to these crossroads. I mean, I do all the time about what do I need to do? And then you go to the Lord and say, Lord, what do I need to do? And you know, of course, we want to hear Him. We want to hear some voice, which, you know, that very seldom ever happens. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it very seldom does. And so people ask me when, you know, because I ask God questions, and I'm honestly, I know He answers me. And now, obviously, it's in my head, and it doesn't sound like, you know, some big grandpa in the sky. It's my voice, but I know it's God. And the way that I know it's God is because I know God. So, you know, this is the deal. And we're going to get into this in the next couple of weeks, but the deal about being able to hear God is you have to know Him. You have to know Him and building that intimacy with Him, because then the more you know of God, the more you can distinguish when it's His voice speaking to you and not yours or the enemy's or whatever else, or somebody else's, you know, a friend that may have said something to you. You might be getting answers from God all the time, but you don't know Him well enough to distinguish that it's His voice. So that's one of the biggest reasons why we want to seek this intimacy with Him, to know who He is. You know, He's already intimate with us. He already intimately knows us. The trick is for you and I to get to intimately know Him. And that's what we're doing in this series, in finding intimacy with God. Again, I said this at the very first lesson, I think, and it's not about finding something that's lost or that you don't have. It's about us finding what already is and then being able to tap into that intimate relationship that is right now. Unless we do that, it's really kind of one-sided, isn't it? It's not two-sided. It's God being intimate with us, but us unable to be intimate with Him. But we can do that as long as we get to know Him. So in this week's, I'm actually going to be in a psalm that's very common, and most people know it. It's Psalm 46. You can turn there if you have your Bibles. If you know anything about Psalm 46, you know that this is the psalm that Martin Luther based his hymn on, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." It was based on Psalm 46. And there's a specific thing that's occurring in this psalm that caused Hezekiah to write this psalm. So I want to give you some tools today in finding our refuge in God. And remember, every single one of these weeks, it's about being able to do this because we know Him. So you have to get to know Him better so that then you will want and can find your refuge in God and not in anything else that goes around. So, you know, let me ask you a question to start this out with. And obviously it's rhetorical since you can't answer me right now. But answer to yourself. When trouble strikes, what do you do first? What's the very first thing you do? And, you know, if you're by yourself, you can be really, you know, honest about this. If you're in a small group right now, you may not want to be as honest out loud. But what's the first thing you do? I'll honestly tell you that often the first thing that I do when trouble strikes is try to find somebody to talk to. I want to find a friend. I call my pastor, call my minister, call my mentor, talk to my husband, something. I feel like I want to talk to somebody about this and get some help. That's my human nature. My nature is to have instant gratification, isn't it? My nature is to have instant reward, instant feedback, instant solution to my problem. And we, as in our flesh, think that that's going to come from someone we can see that's going to give us an answer right there. And finding our refuge and our problem solving in those places. Well, I believe that if we know God the way we should be able to know Him, that instead of someone physically here who quite frankly cannot be your refuge, we would seek the refuge in our Father, the only place where we're ever going to be able to find the solace and the answer and the comfort that we need. So, you know, I think that goes to show and moves in being able to look back on what God's already done. And I think that's why Psalm 46 is such a good one for us to look at here. Psalm 46 was written during the time of the Assyrians had tried to take Jerusalem captive. And there were like 200,000 residents in Jerusalem at this time, and there were about 185,000 enemy, there was a troops, about 185,000 enemies that had been sent by Sennacherib to overtake the city, like they're right outside of the walls. Well, Hezekiah had prayed and prayed and prayed that the Lord would deliver him. Well, Sennacherib, he sent an envoy to the wall and started saying all this stuff, really bad-mouthing Hezekiah and bad-mouthing God and saying, there's no way you're going to be able to stand up against Sennacherib because he's taken over everywhere. So you may as well just go ahead and know that Hezekiah is lying to you, and in fact, if you go ahead and surrender right now, then maybe Sennacherib won't kill all y'all. And that's, my rendition of what happened, but that's basically what happened. Well, Sennacherib didn't know the God of Hezekiah, did he? So in that one night, and these people were, they're here, they see 185,000 soldiers are out there waiting to take the wall the next day. And Hezekiah is praying to the Lord about deliverance. And that night, an angel of the Lord went through the troops, and 185,000 men died at the sound of God's voice that night. This psalm that we're about to look at was written in response to that deliverance, where the people then could look back, and they wanted to record that. They wanted to be able to go back and look and see how was it that God delivered them, so that they could understand the character of God. It's really hard to want to trust somebody to deliver you or help you or come to your rescue if you don't think that they could. if they've not proven to you, or that you haven't seen evidence of that, it's difficult to trust someone to do that. It's the same with God. It's helpful and necessary for you and I to go back and look at the things that God has already done, either in our lives or historically in the lives of his people, because in believing that he is God, that he can do these things, you then can believe and seek refuge in him when trouble and terror and bad things happen in your life. So that's where Hezekiah got this, and that's why Psalm 46 came. So the theme, I think, of Psalm 46 is God is our refuge and he is all we need. And I think that's exactly what they were writing in this place. Now, there's a couple of things I think we have to look at. And the first thing in this psalm is, and I'm going to read it in a minute, but the first thing in this psalm is that trouble is going to come, period. I mean, we've been told trouble's going to come, and the writer here is letting you know this. And let me just show you where it says that. And again, Psalm 46, and I'm going to look at verses 1 through 3, and look at the verbiage here, what he's saying. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. It's that word though that used over and over again. He's not saying if. God is our refuge and our present help in time of trouble if these things happen. He's saying he's our refuge and our present help in times of trouble as these things are happening. Though that's happening, and though this is happening, and though that is happening, and they could believe that because they just witnessed him at the sound of his voice destroying 185,000 enemies of his people. So they were completely believing in this, knowing that the troubles are going to come. Thinking they were going to live some wonderful, easy peasy life as a Christian is just, quite frankly, not biblical. Troubles are going to come. So, I tell people all the time, don't be blindsided by that. Don't be blindsided. Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 4, I think it is, don't be surprised at this fiery trial that's come upon you as if it's some kind of surprise that's unexpected. It's going to come. This stuff's going to happen. And that's what the psalmist is telling us here. And 46 is mentioning global changes. He mentions earthquakes, he mentions storms, he's mentioning wars later on in a couple other verses. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 35 through 38, that the writer of Hebrews mentions some really horrible things that have happened, that believers have had to endure. So those verses say, some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might arise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. Basically, there's just these are believers that had to go through this stuff. So understand that you're not exempt from trouble simply because you're a believer. Warren Wiersbe said this. He said, he, meaning God, doesn't protect us in order to pamper us. And listen to this quote, it's so good. He shelters us so that he can strengthen us to go back to life with its duties and dangers. So, God doesn't protect you so that you can be, this little thing that's not going to learn anything. He does shelter you during the storm, and he shelters you enough so that you can go right back to that life that gave you the storm in the first place, doing what it is that you need to do in his name. Psalm 29 verse 11 says, may the Lord give strength to his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace. And then Isaiah wrote in chapter 40 verse 31, but they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Now, I wanted to talk about a couple of things in terms of, the first thing is, yes, we know troubles are going to come. So what do we know about God so that we then, in the midst of these troubles, can seek him as a refuge? Well, the first thing is that God is sufficient. He is sufficient to take care of anything. I mean, absolutely anything. We just read in verses 1 through 3. He's sufficient in the ragings of nature. I remember we lived in the Philippines years ago, probably like 1990, something like that, 91. I don't remember when that big earthquake was, but we were there during a 6.9 on the Richter scale earthquake. And that was, I've never been in an earthquake before, but to stand on the ground that was made of cement in my house, a cement floor, and it looked like waves in an ocean. There is nothing that'll make you feel more vulnerable than when you're looking at a slab of concrete literally turn to what looks like liquid. The earth can make us just have to go through some stuff, man. And if you don't understand that God is absolutely sufficient and in control of those things, then you can totally lose it in the midst of that and lose it. We look at all the devastating natural disasters that occur in this earth all the time. Well, God is sufficient as a refuge in all of those things. In Jeremiah 14:22 reminds us that, are there any among the false gods of the nations that can bring rain? Or can the heavens give showers? Are you not he, O Lord our God? We set our hope on you, for you do all these things. That's a great truth for us to hang on to. Also, we have to know this about God, that God is sufficient during the raging of nations. And we live in a time where that is something we really need to keep forefront in our brains. Verses 4 through 7 of Psalm 46 say this: there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice and the earth melts. But basically those verses are telling you that God is going to protect his people. He lives amongst his people. And the rest of the world, the nations may just scream and have wars and yell at each other and whatever, but God would simply have to say a word and the earth would melt away. So he is God of over those things, and he is completely, Hezekiah would have known this. Like I said, he just saw 185,000 people get killed because the Lord literally said some words. William Secker said this. He said, the enemies of the church may toss her as waves, but they shall not split her as rocks. That's a pretty picture. Tired she may be, but destroyed she cannot be. Her foundation is the rock of ages, and her defense is the everlasting arms. The adversaries of God's people will push at them as far as their horns will go, but when they have scoured them by persecution as tarnished vessels, then God will throw such wisps into the fire. And I love that he literally calls the enemies of God wisps. And if you ever seen a wisp of something, it's just barely there. That's what he's saying an enemy of God, the enemy of God's people are. And then God is also sufficient over the rebels of the earth, the people who come against you. And that's what he speaks about in verses 8 through 11 of Psalm 46. He says, come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. You know, Proverbs 21:1, and one of my favorite verses that talks about that, speaks to this. It says, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. Doesn't matter who the leader is. Doesn't matter who it is. Doesn't matter if it's somebody that's not Christian or doesn't believe in Jesus. Doesn't matter what country they come from. God is the God of the leader, and he will make them do whatever he needs them to do to the benefit of this people. One of my favorite examples is what happened when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. And God had said to those people, to the Israelites, when you go, make sure you ask all those women, the Egyptian women, the Egyptian families, ask them to give you stuff. Ask them to give you jewels. Ask them to give you pottery. Ask them to give you money. And they're going to give you everything. And in that way, you're going to plunder the Egyptians when you leave. That was actually said in Exodus chapter 3, verses 21 to 22. And then sure enough, as soon as they got released and they were on their way out, they did exactly as the Lord said. And it says in Exodus 12, verses 35 to 36, the Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, which is weird. Why would they be favorably disposed? They just had a bunch of plagues and their firstborn were about, dead because of these people, and yet they're favorably disposed. That has to be God. And so because of that, they gave them what they asked for so that they plundered the Egyptians. God also, he prompted the heart of Cyrus whenever Cyrus allowed the Israelites to go back to Jerusalem and build the wall after the Babylonian exile. Cyrus was not a Christian king. He wasn't a believer in God. He wasn't Jewish. He wasn't an Israelite. He didn't believe in it. He was a pagan. But God turned this pagan king's heart so that this pagan king let God's people go back to Jerusalem and start building the wall and rebuilding the temple there. That God will make, he's the ruler of those things. I think there is a couple of things. Just I want to end here. What do you and I do? And I love to take these kinds of truths and bring them down to some practicality. Practically, then, what does that mean that I need to do when troubles hit my life so that I am practicing taking my refuge in my Father? Well, the first thing is, and that we have to train ourselves to, is that when tragedy strikes, seek the Lord first, pray. Ask your Lord to protect you, to give you guidance and wisdom and discernment and direction throughout this. And then meet with him every day. You can't just go to God and when trouble strikes and think you're going to be able to understand who he is enough to hear from him and know when he's talking to you. You have to get to know him. And in order to get to know him, you have to meet with him every single day, sometimes more than once a day. Get to know him in his word. Meditate on the word. That's where God comes alive, and that's where he shows you who he is. And the more you know of God and his character, the more that when you pray, you'll be able to hear him. And finally, the third thing is you need to seek, after you've sought the Lord, seek the influence and the support of fellow believers. That's the reason why the writer of Hebrews tells us not to forsake the gathering of the saints. It's not because it's a law. It's not because it's a rule. It's because you need that. You need the saints. You don't need to forsake the gathering of the saints, which means church. You don't need to not do that because you need them. They're the ones who are going to uplift you and uphold God's word for you and hold you accountable to it. God first, get to know him, go to him first, and then go to be supported by your believing brothers and sisters. Again, as I want to stress this over and over again the weeks to come, the trick is always going to be knowing God first. If you know God, then you can find the intimacy that he already has with you, and then you can also in turn have it with him. God bless you. I'm looking forward to continuing in this series with you. I want to re-stress again that there are Bible studies at my website, debwaterbury.com, that go along with each one of these. I highly suggest that you get those Bible studies because it will take you deeper in the Word and give you deeper application in each one of these. God bless you. See you next time. Thank you for joining me today on this episode of Get Real with Deb Waterbury. I hope you were blessed, and I hope you got some information that's going to help you get through your day. If you want any more information on any of my books or my articles or on any of my future speaking engagements, you can find all that information at debwaterbury.com. God bless you.